Welcome to Cor Ecclesiae, Episode 4. Today we have a number of interesting topics, two primarily that we're going to be looking at, and we have a guest panelist. But first of all, let me recapitulate the very nature of the mission of Cor Ecclesiae. Our job is to be, in very many ways, a chamber of second sober thought. In other words, we take ideas that have been percolating, that have arisen, that prescient reporters and journalists and authors have been talking about in the life of the church, and we give it some kind of reflection at our end. And some of it may echo opinions of others, and some of it will be, I think, profoundly original. So that's what we do. And this week, we're going to be looking at a couple of topics. And as I say, we have a guest that we have with us today, who is also long associated with Sacred Heart University. So let me introduce them. First of all, of course, is Michelle Lors. Michelle is kind of the eminence grise of the operation. I mean, she has been a central figure in helping many things unfold, particularly Catholic studies, its life, its center, the Bergoglio lectures. So many things that happen in the Catholic orbit of Sacred Heart University are attributable to the energy and to the vision of Michelle Lors. Michelle is also the Associate Dean of the Arts and Science faculty and the author of various books, including one on Joan Didion. Charlie Gillespie is also an associate dean of a new program in the performing arts faculty and is the author of a new book that is just out, I think, Charlie. You were mentioning that. And it is God on Broadway, revealing the sacred in the spectacle. We're going to be looking actually at a program specifically around the Catholic imagination. And we'll do that sometime early in the new year. And as part of that program, we'll be talking about Charlie's new book. Dan Rober is the chair of the Department of Catholic Studies, a regular contributor to Commonweal magazine. Read his stuff there. It's always interesting and fresh. And he's also working on a new book looking at the relationship of the church, politics in the post-1945 world, and perhaps in the world of a new totalitarianism. As we know, there's been a lot of work done by Vaticanologists and historians on that period, the entre-deux-guerres, between the wars, and particularly with the rise of fascism. But there's not been as much done post-1945. And we are in, as everyone knows now, a change of era. So we'll be looking very forward to seeing what you have to say about this, Dan. Our guest today is Michael Sean Winters. Michael is well known to many people across the Americas. He is the U.S. correspondent for The Tablet, the Catholic International Weekly in London, which in my view is inarguably the finest English publication we have in journalism. He's also a columnist for the National Catholic Reporter. He has written himself various books and articles in other publications, but very importantly, he is also a long-standing member now of the Sacred Heart family as a senior fellow working with the Catholic Studies Center and working in particular areas around some of the committees and subcommittees of the USCCB. So we're very pleased to have you join the panel today, Michael. So welcome aboard.
Good to be with you.
Okay, I think we'll start with you, actually, because you're the star on the scene, but also, and this is important, things have been developing and developing pretty quickly at the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops. You, of course, have covered the scene for quite a while, well informed about the players, and in fact, you had an NCR article prior to the elections in which you outlined who you thought would be the serious contenders for this election. Well, how did it play out?
So, when I got to Baltimore on the Sunday before the meeting starts on Monday now with a executive session, and the morning is actually prayer, retreat. They have mass at the Basilica, then they have executive session on Monday. Tuesday opens the public session, and they began with the elections of the new president. But even on Sunday, I was hearing people thought that Coakley had it locked up, but I would hear, well, I'm voting for Flores, but Coakley has it locked up. It was closer, I think, than a lot of people expected. Coakley, I should say, has been the secretary. He's the Archbishop of Oklahoma. Before that, he had been on several committees. He's a light, affable person. but he's very much, from the kind of culture warrior wing. He is the ecclesiastical advisor of the Napa Institute, which is that right wing, organization for filthy rich people, started by Tim Bush, that has been trying to really introduce a laissez-faire economics and put it in Catholic drag theologically. And then he also was one of the 40 or so bishops who, in 2018, when then Archbishop Carlo Maria Vigano attacked Pope Francis, accused him of covering up the McCarrick scandal, and called for his resignation. Coakley was one of the ones who issued a public statement of support and commending Vigano's character without saying anything kind about the Pope, to whom he had taken a vow of loyalty. And that, I think, was the main reason, more than the others, that the election was so close. I think people felt Coakley's done a good job in the offices at the conference, but that really bothered a very significant minority, not quite a majority. A majority said, we don't care, we want the other stuff. And I should say Bishop Flores is not the warm, fuzzy, affable guy that Coakley is. He's very, very bright. He's been very involved in the synodality. So I guess the bottom line is part of this was a referendum of, are we going to decisively move in a direction to embrace the reforms of Francis and now Leo, or not? Or are we going to, hold off still? And the hold off position won. And I really want to, I think it was a mistake for them. Every bishop in 3 years is going to have something they need out of Rome. Rome, everything takes an eternity in Rome, which is why it's called the Eternal City, right? And you want the president of your conference to be someone who can go help you get stuff done. And Coakley, because of the Vigano stuff and the Napa Institute, is not well regarded in Rome. He's never worked there. He's never studied there. So it doesn't really, I just think it was a mistake for them at that very pragmatic level, as well as the more, kind of ideological considerations. That said, Flores was then elected vice president on the first ballot. Flores is himself, pretty conservative, kind of a Jacques Maritain guy, I would say, is ideologically, but he's also a border bishop. He is very articulate. He was the chair of the doctrine committee. He really worked hand in glove with the Catholic Health Association on the ethical and religious directives, which were also adopted at this meeting. But he really engaged in the synodal process and became kind of the U.S. bishop's point person on that, both in Rome and here. And so there was certainly an openness to Francis and now Leo that he had. So I don't want to say it was only ideological. I think the personalities and all of that played a part, but it was surprisingly close. And then Flores was elected vice president on the first ballot, so he is now on the executive committee, and in 3 years will presumably be elected president of the conference. So you could see things moving. The other thing I'll quickly mention, and then we can move on, is in the 6 committee chairs elections, 4 are decidedly of the pro-Francis, pro-Leo group. 1 is completely opaque to me, and 1 would be in the kind of cultural warrior resistance mode. So the administrative committee still has an enormous amount of responsibility in the conference structure. And so 4 good, Team Francis guys were added to that. And so that was a really good outcome.
I don't know Coakley at all, but I have met Flores on a couple of occasions because, of course, he was a representative of the Synod over the 2 sessions. And when he would meet in the press conferences, as you may remember, his approach is very learned, very serious. He's not a bubbly, effervescent kind of guy, but everything he said seemed to me both measured and insightful. That he wasn't incendiary, he was reflective and whatnot. So it is gratifying to think that he's going to have a leadership position at the USCCB precisely because of his commitment to these qualities. It may in part be his Maritain influence, I don't know, but he's a very different character from the one you described in terms of Archbishop Coakley. Before we go to the panel and they ask their questions to you, were there any really surprising moments, something that caught you off guard, Michael, when you were there?
I'd say this: what came through loud and clear is the opposition to Pope Francis the last 11, 12 years um really thought that the world thought like they did, that this was a disaster of a pontificate, and the cardinals after Francis was bad weather, and when it passed, the cardinals would see things the way they did, and select somebody to kind of roll back those reforms. And of course, that did not happen. They elected Leo, who was the candidate of Team Francis in the conclave. And there were options. Like, Erdo would have rolled things back. Paroline would have rolled things back. The cardinals overwhelmingly and quickly coalesced around the person who was the most obvious candidate for continuing on Francis's reforms. And he's not an 80-something Argentine. He's a young 70. So for most of the bishops, this is their last pope. Like, so there's no like waiting for something to change or whatever. And they were wrestling with that, and you could see that. And because he is an American, and I did a column on this, things land differently. So when you had the controversy about Senator Durbin and Cardinal Cupich and some bishops attacking Cardinal Cupich because he was giving an award to a pro-choice senator, and the Holy Father weighed in, and he didn't say anything different from what Francis would have said. But with Francis, we would not have heard what Francis said. We would have heard the interpreter, right? Now we hear it in Midwest English, and that just lands differently. I see where I notice that most is the mainstream press, how well articles do about the Vatican. Normally, like a story for like Reuters or AP, they don't usually break the top 10 or top 25 if it's a Vatican story. Consistently in the last couple months, you've had Pope Leo stories in the top 4 or 5, and that just has historically not happened. The other thing I haven't written this yet, so but it really deserves attention. At the conference, there were 2 major issue votes. So we tend to think of like culture war as a style, but some people also confuse that with issues, right? And I don't think there's any issue that's particularly a culture war. It's how you approach the issue and how it has been dealt with historically. So the 2 biggest votes that they had, other than the elections on issues, were one, the immigration statement, which was a weak statement to begin with. And then Cardinal Cupich made an important amendment, which then led the news because that strengthened the statement so much on immigration, and that really broke through for a variety of reasons. One, this video that they produced, but also that we forget, those of us who swim in these waters all the time, how powerful the church's language is about human dignity and solidarity. And like, we can read a paragraph that mentions human dignity, and we almost kind of pass over the phrase in our mind. It's so free. But that's not in the ambient culture. And so it landed, I think, very, very powerfully. And it was passed by a vote of, I wrote down, 216 to 5. So overwhelming support, right, for this document. The other document they voted on was the ethical and religious directives. The one that should have gotten more comment that didn't was it explicitly recognized the right of Catholic workers to organize. And this is at a time when certain Catholic health institutions and Catholic institutions of higher education
Oh, yes.
are union busting. Loyola Marymount, just busted its unions and cited its religious liberty, argument to get out of it. And they're right in terms of civil court. They will win, and they should win. Like, we don't want the government telling us who cannot be a minister, but. I did a column suggesting that the faculty at Loyola Marymount, now there's also a case at St. John's University in Queens, they've got a canonical case. That, these are organizations that are not severed from their orders. And if their order is violating the teachings of the church, they should file a case at the dicastery for consecrated life. I don't know whether they're going to win or not, but I know they're going to get a hell of a lot of bad publicity, and it forces them to really wrestle with their identity question. So that was one thing, and then the other part of the ERDs was obviously the church is not going to perform any quote and gender affirming. I hate that phrase. It's so creepy in that it decides the issue. And they voted, again, overwhelmingly. There was 206 to 8 to pass the ERDs. And so New Ways Ministry went crazy about that. Tom Homan went crazy about the immigration. There are these extremes in the church that get way too much space, and resonate sadly in the Catholic Academy, that believe things that just are never going to happen in the life of the church. And so I think it's really important to realize how united the bishops were on two very controverted issues of American public life right now, and how out of step, therefore, some of these fringe, and we just, we have to exercise some discipline, our institutions, whether it's healthcare, whether it's education, whether it's, priestly formation, to not let, and the media, I should add, to say, can we stop with these distracting conversations that are being driven by fringe elements that get a lot of funding from somewhere, make a lot of noise, but really the life of the church, there are many more important things for us to be concerned about.
Okay, thank you very much for this. Very thorough. Dan, let's go to the round table now with the other panelists. Start with you, Dan. How do you have a particular question for Michael, or a point of clarification and correction, whatever?
I'd like to just give a few comments elaborating on the election to start with. And I'm sure we'll get to some of the migration document and some of Pope Leo's further comments on that later on, because I think it's very clear how exercised he is about this. But the comment I would make about the presidential election in the USCCB is that I thought it was unsurprising and uninspiring. So in some ways, concurring with what Michael Sean said, I would say what's particularly concerning, again, I do think things are changing. Also to his point, I think there is pressure. The presence of Pope Leo does change the dynamic in terms of both, his age, but also I think more of a feeling that he kind of has their number than perhaps existed with Francis, because there's no ability, and he's himself has said there's no ability to blame it on translation, blame it on not understanding the country. But I think that Archbishop Coakley's connections to the Napa Institute are particularly concerning at this moment, because one of the things that's been going on the last couple of years, and that's been very noticeable here in New York City, where I live, is that Napa is trying to kind of reframe itself from just being this kind of plutocratic summer retreat and, even kind of intellectual exercise, to being kind of your friendly neighborhood Catholic organization. So the last couple of years, they put on a big Eucharistic procession here in New York, which has drawn people from all over the area, right? Nothing wrong with putting on Eucharistic processions, but very clearly with their name all over it, right? There's no kind of, this is a great thing, and then there are little asterisks that it's funded by the Napa Institute. It's very clearly kind of trying to paint themselves as something you can't argue with as a supporter of authentic Catholic piety. So I think having their chaplain as president of the USCCB in this particular moment is concerning, in that their programming is growing, and it's part of the kind of general shift of discourse in the church, I think, toward influencers funded by conservative organizations, and often going through things like Word on Fire and the Hallow app as kind of main channels of discourse in the Catholic Church in the U.S. So I think that's a major concerning trend that this does not help with. So that would be my commentary on the election. And again, I think the election of Archbishop Flores as vice president, and again, his likelihood of becoming president, is good. But I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done in the interim, particularly in kind of pushing back against this kind of influencer culture that is taking over large segments of the church.
Michael, Sean, you mentioned something about the Napa. You thought that there was a minority of bishops that were anxious about Coakley's connection with it, but the majority were fine. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, obviously he won in spite of it. And the interesting thing about Napa also is, Tim Bush is a very controversial personality, even among certain conservative circles. And so, it there are people who go to Napa who do not share and who show up for that Eucharistic procession who don't share their kind of ideological bearings or maybe even know about it. And that's the question then is, which is more dangerous, the devil you know or the devil that's hiding behind the Eucharistic procession? I don't think there is a, Tim Bush has been pretty aggressive in his effort to use his wealth to influence the hierarchy, starting with, in the aughts, he paid for the design and renovation of the apartment for the prefect of the pontifical household, then Archbishop Harvey, now Cardinal Harvey. And it was like hundreds of thousands of dollars, right? And so this is his MO, but like he really angered, the Bishop of Orange County, who's quite conservative, Kevin Van, because of the way he handled the sale of a cathedral. There was a time in maybe 6-8 years ago where the U.S. Bishops Conference, their spring meeting moves around, and they were going to have it in Santa Barbara, California, at one of Tim Bush's hotels, and it's the most expensive hotel in California. And the California bishops, led by Archbishop Gomez, who's no liberal, wrote to the USCCB and said, this would be a scandal, and if you hold it there, we will not attend. Like these are hotel rooms at $800 a night at a time when our people are struggling. So they backed off and they kept it at a hotel in San Diego that they've been using for years. So it's that kind of thing. I mean, I worry about Bush. At the end of the day, I don't see, he has a choice of going down a kind of schismatic or pseudo-schismatic path and creating his own little kingdom. But I don't see it reverberating in the wider world. I don't see them getting a hearing in this papacy. So I worry about it, but I don't stay up at night worrying about it.
Just one thing before we move on to Charlie here. We're talking about Bush reminds me in a way of the kind of influence that Tom Monaghan had in the 80s and 90s with Legatus and his own presence in Rome. He would show up. I would be at the Extraordinary Synod and other synods, and there would be Tom Monaghan entertaining various individuals, cardinals, other prelates, in various trattoria around Rome. His influence considerable, extravagant, and not particularly elegant person. I mean, I don't know Tim Bush, but certainly in the case of Monaghan, he was in your face on everything. And whether it was a Mel Gibson film or whether it was building the cathedral in Managua, Nicaragua, does Bush exercise the same kind of influence in papal circles as Monaghan clearly did during the John Paul II pontificate?
No, he does. I mean, I think he has, they just put out something the other day, and the for a fundraiser, they have these different circles. If you give 5,000, you're in the bishop circle, the cardinal, and the picture of the cardinal circle was Ray Burke, who is probably, the least influential cardinal on the planet, right? Because he's batty, and everybody kind of knows that. The other thing also, I'll say one thing about Tom Monaghan that I don't see in Bush. I don't know this, but I think I would. It's the kind of thing I would know if it was present. When the hurricane Hugo, I think it was, struck the Virgin Islands, the first plane to arrive filled with supplies was Tom Monaghan's. And he was a very generous person with those kinds of extremities. And the joke at the time was the pizza was going to be free because it had been delivered late, but
it was more than pizza, though, right? It was more than
it was they brought medical supplies, and
supplies.
And similar to what the AFL-CIO did in Puerto Rico after the Hurricane Maria, and really imparted some hope there. And that went not just to the Bishop of the Virgin Islands at the time, who was now Cardinal Sean O'Malley, but to the people of the whole island. And so that that was part of his mix also.
Yeah.
But Rome has changed. Rome is from the 1970s and 80s. Obviously, the global South is dominant in a way it was not then, in the councils and in the appointments. You saw the appointment today of Anthony Ekpo as the assessor. He's from Nigeria, and then was in Brisbane, Australia for a while. It's a really different dynamic over there. And critically, you've got a young pope who is on board the vision of Francis, and so I think people like Tim Bush are going to be continually out of step, and either they'll come along and have an experience of conversion, which I hope, or they'll kind of become, on the wasting a lot of people's money. I'll tell you that. If you really want to invest in something, don't send the money to the NAVA Institute. I don't see any evidence of a future for them that's consequential.
I think you're right about that in terms of the Monaghan era being linked with the Wojtyła one. Even with Pope Benedict, there was some distancing, and with Francis, it was complete. You're right, and the climate, the complexion of Rome has changed considerably. Okay, Charlie, you want to weigh in here?
So there's a couple of comments that Michael Sean made that I just want to uplift for us because I think they're really important. On the one hand, there's a real easiness to see the closeness of the vote for the president of the USCCB as replicating American polarization. We've got people in various camps, we get nice symbols, and we've got a relatively close vote. On the other hand, though, I think Michael Sean pointing out to remind us how overwhelming the votes were for 3 other issues. We've already talked about the directives and we've talked about migration, but it was also an over 200 vote to consecrate the United States to the Sacred Heart of Jesus in June. So you also see some issues that we might expect polarized, lining up on 2 sides of an aisle, of the church suggesting that there is something about coming together on certain issues, that Catholics have a moral obligation to be guiding certain conversations with clear clarity. I'm really excited by the USCCB, a sentence I never thought I would say out loud, about the fact that the response to what's going to be an interesting time of reflecting on words like Christian nationalism and words like what does it mean to be Catholic in the United States of America and what is America with an American Pope? In that year of the 250th anniversary, what is the theological ideal we're going to uplift? One of the major themes of the end of Pope Francis's pontificate and the first major apostolic exhortation we got from Pope Leo, the theme of the Sacred Heart of Jesus as an expression of God's love in the world. How else can we respond to the pressing questions of our moment, if not to recognize that the church at its core must be proclaiming a gospel of love at all times? I'm thrilled that while we do have some culture war things that might pick up the dialogue in the wider worldly press, for those in the Catholic bubble of the United States, we're going to have to emphasize that if you can't check your argument against the gospel of love, there's going to be a real problem for it getting any traction in a year and a place consecrated to the Sacred Heart of Jesus.
Yeah, very good. Michael, in reaction to Charlie.
Yeah, I agree. And I think, again, the other thing is, I would just add is the ecclesiological point that, we have a point of unity in the Catholic Church, and it's the Bishop of Rome. And it's really funny to, an example of this, like there are parts of, I write at NCR, which is kind of the, flagship liberal newspaper. And when I started in 2009, I think one of the reasons that I kind of stood out compared to some of my colleagues was I loved Benedict. And I thought Benedict was writing some wonderful things, and I really engaged him. And I will still argue that there are certain lines in Caritas and Veritate that are much more radical than anything Francis wrote. Now, Francis wrote in a very accessible, this economy kills, right? And it broke through that way. But I would suggest, the passage about the need for gratuitousness in the economy is actually more radical than a kind of standard, critique of neoliberalism. And so that's where, and when you see it, what I love about being in Baltimore is, we take bishops out for lunch and dinner. I think I had 1 cardinal, 6 archbishops, and 4 bishops that I was breaking bread with in the course of the 3 days I was there. And what you realize is, like, some of them were appointed by John Paul II and then, moved up by Francis. Then there's a lot more continuity than people want to see at the level of teaching, at the level of belief. And these guys believe what the church teaches. That's at the end of the day, people are like, oh, well, they've got to become more welcoming of capitalism or, opposed to this, that, the other thing. No, they don't. Like that. That's just not good. There is obviously a development that goes on. I think there's obviously differences of emphasis and stuff. But I think you're right, Charlie, that at the end of the day, the church has to be able to learn how to listen less. I'll take Catholics for Choice as an example. They brought a billboard that was on the highway that you usually take from the airport to the hotel in Baltimore. And they raised, I don't know, $45,000, $50,000, whatever they raised to put up this billboard. I just don't think it had any effect. I just, like that's a settled question. The church, if you really think the church is going to embrace abortion, I don't know what planet you're on. I mean, it's nuts. A cause close to my heart is the rights of workers in Catholic institutions, and there were some labor, protesters out front in the healthcare industry calling for that, and I'm totally with them. But again, like totally counterproductive. Like that, just the bishops know how to get the information that they want and need from the ambient culture largely. And I think that has changed also since the Tom Monahan years. I think there are more progressive Catholics who have demonstrated their loyalty over the years, who are listened to and are effectual. And Michelle and I have been very involved in this project called The Way Forward, and we're going to be having our 5th gathering of bishops, theologians, and other church leaders in February, and that's become a resource, right? Like that is something where bishops who can turn to it. It's not a progressive answer to the Napa Institute in a way, shape, or form. We always have some conservative speakers, some conservative bishops in the room, but it is an alternative. Like I think there is a sense that the Tim Bushes of the world might want to do to the Catholic Church in this country what Trump successfully did to the Republican Party, like make it his own, and it's just not going to happen. There's no way that that's going to happen. And I do think there's issues like the bugaboo of Christian nationalism that we just have to resist and say, well, wait. First, define it. And yes, as an American, I believe that our laws should be influenced by the values I bring as a citizen, and my values happen to be rooted in my Christian beliefs. Your values may be rooted in something else, but the fact that mine are rooted in my religion does not disqualify me from participating as a full citizen in shaping the laws. I like Dr. King. Dr. King was a Christian nationalist, full stop. He had a vision of the United States that was deeply rooted in the gospel. And we shouldn't be allergic to that. We shouldn't be afraid of that. We should be a little bit wiser about the groups that really do dislike Catholicism and religion more generally. They are not our natural allies. And yet I think for certain issues, we on the Catholic left find ourselves allied with them. And we've got to be a little more Catholic and a little less lefty.
Before we move on to Michelle, just building on something that Charlie said here with regard to the Sacred Heart. Now, we realize that this was important for Francis with the subsequent document, and of course now with the transition document, really co-authored in a way by Leo and Francis. Again, the Sacred Heart plays an important role. This is an 18th century Jesuit devotion. Why is it so compelling? I mean, we know people like Teilhard de Chardin gave it a kind of modern gloss that was very appealing for various people. But in terms of its deeper popularity, why the reappearance of devotion to the Sacred Heart? Is it because of its expansiveness, because of its gratuitousness, because of its inner capacity not to discriminate? Why this devotion? Why its recovery? Charlie, and then maybe Michael, if you have something to say on that.
Yeah, one quick thought on the devotion to the Sacred Heart, Michael, is it's also one of the tradition's oldest expressions of lay piety that spread across cultures. So I think a return to the devotion to the Sacred Heart is actually an ecclesial expression of synodality. The idea that there were symbols and ways of relating to God's love that crossed different boundaries and borders and cultural identities that still mattered, but were shared. And I think if we think about the fact that images of the Sacred Heart of Jesus were in the homes of Catholics from the whole world, and they might not have spoken the same language. They were going to the same liturgy in Latin, but they certainly were not hanging out together at lunch afterwards. But they were sharing this devotion to the Sacred Heart. I think that's one of the ways it's coming back. It's how we can imagine walking together the synodal path as a church.
Well, we'll see at some point whether that eclipses the Divine Mercy tradition that began with John Paul II, or whether it serves as a complement. Michael?
Yeah, and both. I think this is really important. So obviously the liturgical reforms of the Second Vatican Council said, look, we've got to refocus on the Eucharist, which is the central, liturgical and kind of self-defining act of the church. And that was needed. You just, you go back and you look at the video of like John F. Kennedy's funeral, and like, the singer is going on while the cardinal's in this awful Latin doing his prayers. I mean, it was crazy. And a lot of, in the immediate aftermath of the council, then a lot of the personal devotions and personal pieties went away. And that was some of the buttresses that, especially the personal faith. I think key of the Sacred Heart is people have a heart, right? It is it connect. I think what Charlie said about the lay piety, like they have to have something where they really connect with, and in both the Divine Mercy and the Sacred Heart, you're seeing lay people reclaim a sense of personal piety that is not challenging the Eucharist, right? But is alongside it and helping to support it, and that people can just kind of buy into in a way that helps them, become more devout, more pious. Piety, religion, devotion, liturgy, these all should be operating together, not in opposition. And I think when you go back to some of the theology of the early 70s, there was a sense of putting them in opposition, which is understandable in that time. And to use a kind of academic analogy, I would say it's like the Land O'Lakes, right? Like we had to get out of ecclesiastical control. What the authors of the Land O'Lakes didn't realize is the Catholic subculture was no longer walking in into the classroom with the nuns and the brothers, and that the Catholic students had been raised not in a Catholic neighborhood, but in a multi-ethnic, multiracial, multi-religious suburb. And so the Catholic culture started vanishing before they could realize it, because they had not thought that. That's not an indictment of the Land O'Lakes. Like, it had to happen. And I think the same thing happened with the focus on Eucharist. And now we're at a point where we can start reintegrating some lay, more pietistic and personal devotions that people want. They need that.
And certainly Pope Francis was the Pope of popular piety, and Leo seems to be falling exactly in the same line. Okay, Michelle, now we've left the best to the last.
Well, there are a number of things, but I was going to start with Coakley, but I'm going to move backwards and start with the Sacred Heart of Jesus, because I think in presenting, for example, Dilexit Nos to our students, right, they respond, especially to the first pages where Francis is talking about heart, and that's universal. People respond to that, the idea of love. Francis talks about love and heart. And so, people from a widespread will respond to that language where they feel loved, they feel embraced, they feel included. And so I think, Charlie, to your point that yes, we will as Americans have to, say who we are. But this is a foundational piece, and this is a piece that gathers us together. And the interesting thing is that when Leo gave his homily on synodality, he said the supreme rule of the church is love, and that the synodal teams respond to love, not to power, and that we walk, he said, truth is not possessed, but we walk seeking truth, guided by our restless hearts, which seek love, with love, capital L, love, right? And so I think that, I agree with you, Charlie. It's also foundational to our synodality. And if we move toward synodality as a church, this will be a foundational principle. The other thing that you mentioned, Michael, Sean, was interesting to me, because you said how we gloss over when we say human dignity created in the image of God, and that makes everybody have inviolable dignity and sacredness. We gloss over it because we swim in those waters. And you're right about that. There was an article, I don't know, in the New York Times, I think it was by David French, who's not Catholic, right? And he was talking about the importance of Catholicism and Leo as the most important moral voice, moral witness, because he is talking about human dignity. That's the basis of his pronouncements about immigration, about the vulnerable, about the privileging of the poor. It's based in human dignity and Christ's love. The gospel message is Christ's love for all of us, right? And so French is like astonished by this language. And he's talking about how powerful this is. And he's pitting it against the Christian national, the evangelical church. And so I think Leo, is having an important effect. He is not, he is not dramatic, but he has not stopped talking. He has not stopped pronouncing. He has not stopped commenting on the climate, on the grave immoral work of states that abuse poor immigrants. And so I think we're seeing this influence. And I'm wondering if, so for example, in today's Times, we saw how the bishop's statement on immigration is being reflected in many of the parishes. And so there was an article, even in fact, our friend Cardinal Tobin, who we had at Sacred Heart and who I know is a good friend of yours, talked about he had never seen such unity among the bishops as at that moment. And they were interviewing different churches in New Jersey, Bishop Flores in Texas. And they even interviewed a student at Clemson about this. And so my point is, even though that statement in the beginning was weak, perhaps without Cardinal Supich's, stronger statement at the end, it's starting to have, forgive the phrase, a trickle-down effect, right? It's starting to have that. And can I ask, wasn't it Leo who was making statements before the bishops' meeting to say to Mark Seitz, I think the bishops in America need to respond to this. I think they need to make a statement that talks about immigration. And so they did make a statement. Now, I don't know that there's a direct line from what Leo said to their making the statement, but what I'm seeing is Leo making the statement, the bishops make a statement, and now this is being reflected in the parishes. And in fact, NCR made reported on students at Catholic colleges, and I don't know, it was overwhelming 90% of them responding to the social justice issues and responding to what the gospel says about social justice. Now, I know I'm reporting on that article and on that survey very quickly. But these students who they interviewed also said how Francis and Leo influenced them, that they felt that especially Francis was talking, in his more pastoral way, that quote, not about rules and regulations, but about being embraced and included and belonging. And this is the message that I think is taking hold. Even now, I think we're going to see a change in our young students. So the last thing I would say was about Coakley. One more thing. Coakley made some comments that he would, for example, retract his support of Vigano. That it wasn't. He thought Vigano in the beginning was just sort of a nice person, etc. But later he found out some of the things that Vigano stood for, and he would not support those things now. And that he wishes that he could meet Leo because he would want to see that the bishops of America love Leo, want to, listen to Leo, etc. I take those comments at face value, but I think they're interesting comments that he made, and I don't know if you've read them or heard them or what you think about that.
I want to just go to Dan here because of a point that you raised, Michelle, about the immigration statement. And Michael Sean also talked about this in terms of the bishops. In terms of Leo himself, Leo's entered the American orbit, specifically in one case supporting or at least trying to understand Supich's relationship to Durban and the award, and then Durban's withdrawing it and whatever. And he was supportive of Cardinal Supich. He's come out very clearly in an interview with Castor Gandolfo in support of the bishop's statement on immigration, and talks about the assaults on humanity. He still, by and large, however, doesn't identify the political orbit in which this is happening. What is the future here? Will the American Pope be drawn further and further into either confrontation or mitigation with the Trumpian policies and the violence that they inflict on a Christian ethos, or will he maintain a studied distance, as is typical of papal politics by and large, and papal diplomacy? What do you think of the future in light of the immigration statement? Does it augur future interventions by Pope Leo, even perhaps stronger? Dan, and then Michael.
So I think it's very clear, if you look at the trajectory of Leo on this, going back to February when he was still Cardinal Prevost, right, when he was retweeting an NCR article about J.D. Vance being wrong about immigration specifically. And given that he is clearly a very measured man who, again, very different personality than Francis, who kind of put it a little bit more out there in terms of when he made comments and everything. But the fact that he keeps going to the well on this particular issue and making statements about it, and making very clear what he thinks of it every time somebody puts a microphone in front of him and asks him about migration, he is quite clear about it. He points to, the basics of Catholic teaching on human dignity, also points to the fact that people's dignity is being violated, right? This is not a theoretical issue. He's not saying if there were a situation where somebody's human dignity are being violated, that would be bad. I think it's, given his measured personality, I think, frankly, the amount of commentary he's given on it indicates somebody who's enraged about this. Somebody who feels very passionately about this, but who is also committed to going about it in a way that is also not going to use every kind of bullet he has in the gun, so to speak, like while the thing is still going on, right? He needs to preserve room to make stronger statements should those be needed. But I also think, again, what the U.S. bishops came out with, and again, as Michael Sean said, Cardinal Supich's key role in that, who clearly is somebody who has a positive relationship with Leo. Every indication has indicated that, has shown that. I think we're continuing to see him push on this, but again, in a way that avoids getting involved in the partisan political aspects of it, just in the sense that everybody knows the partisan political aspects of it. I don't think anybody's unaware of who's in favor of this. And I think if this keeps going on, we may see further maneuvers. There may be further actions from Rome on this. But I think, so far, he's being very forthright and very clear.
Michael Sean.
And I think, this is one of the things that David French made the point, which is part of his, this is not Trump versus Leo in the sense, Leo is in a different lane. He's a religious leader, not a political leader. And it's really important that that his statements not be reducible to politics. It's like there's a different thing that I think we Americans, and it happens on both the left and the right, like we collapse the ethics and the politics a little bit too quickly. And secular folk don't necessarily have a kind of a pre-moral, a pre-political, and we do, right? Like we've got that anthropological and soteriological sensibilities that inform what we mean by human dignity, and they don't, and this is a really, really important thing. He's an Augustinian. We haven't talked about that all hour. This is a guy who is deeply rooted in one of the most thoughtful, provocative, challenging theologians of all time. And I think for Americans, what I'm hoping, I just had to said this on a panel somewhere, I forget where. Oh, that Augustine in Americans are like, we received it through Calvinism, right? And American Catholicism has always I think, been a little bit too accommodating to the ambient culture when we tried to make our way in, and we did let our religion get privatized. We did reduce it a little bit to ethics, and in terms of the Augustinianism, Augustine got a bad name as the guy. He's always talking about sin. And what I'm hoping this Pope will do, and I think this is especially a challenge for academics, when you read Augustine, he obviously he talks about sin a lot, but not to stop there, but to lead you to the overabundance of grace. And that, I think we lost that in the popular culture. It's like, and I'll never forget, I had a great mentor, Monsignor Lorenzo Albacete, who was a Puerto Rican priest of the Archdiocese of Washington. And we were talking about sex one day, and he said, "Yo, Mike, when Saint Augustine tells us that the conjugal act open to procreation, a married couple, open to procreation, even this is stained by the sin of concupiscence," he's telling us something very liberating. That's the Augustine I think we will see from Leo that is not known in American culture. Right? And this is going to be I think this is a challenge for every theologian. I think there are two challenges for Leo, and seeing as I suspect most of the academics will listen to this podcast, one is revisit Augustine, and how do we get him in a Catholic rather than a Calvinistic understanding? What does that mean for American culture and society at this time? And then the second part of it is that Augustine, how do we wrestle with, we live in this spontaneous age and video, and I think one of the reasons that Bishop's message got through was they did this short video of it, and we're raising children, on the screens and all this. And Augustine, I think you can't rush it. Like, you have to sit with Augustine. You have to reread Augustine. You've got to go back a page again and again. And can our culture tolerate that? Can we teach, especially our young people, at a pedagogical way, like, take your time with this, read it, pole, legge, right? This is that you can't grasp everything you want, the depth of the faith, the depth of the devotion to the Sacred Heart, the depth of our theology on immigration. You can't in a 30-second Instagram video. And so I hope that this Pope succeeds in saying to our culture in a meaningful way, tolle lege, like that there's a huge invitation here. And I think it will spill out into certain specifics. I do not imagine the first Augustinian Pope will abandon just war theory. I'm just going to go on a limb and say, I don't see that happening. And I think that's an important thing. I think there are other parts of it where Augustine, and I'm no Augustine scholar, but I remember when Isaiah Berlin did that great little essay, The Hedgehog and the Fox. And it was based on a fragment of a poem by Aeschylus, and it said, the fox knows many things, the hedgehog knows one big thing. And Augustine was labeled a hedgehog, right? And Aquinas was labeled a fox. And obviously, since Leo XIII, the Thomistic vision has been predominant in the life of this church. At Vatican II, you get obviously the natural law is there, but you get a biblical focus that had, the funniest thing when you go back and you read Rerum Novarum is there's almost no biblical citations in it at all. And that's unconceivable after Vatican II. And I guess my question is with Leo, can we get some of that, the hedgehog? And I'd be curious to ask the group, like, what is the one big thing that Augustine knew?
Oh, I have to jump in here immediately.
Yeah, go ahead, Johnny.
Right. So I love Michael Sean reminding us that we have a son of Augustine as Pope, because I was trying my best not to bring it up in today's podcast, but it's his fault, not mine.
Oh, you've brought it up in every other podcast.
I have. So Michael Sean, in the role of Charlie Gillespie today, just two things to point out about what Augustine knew, right? That sense of the restless heart, that we're driven by our desire for God. That's why St. Thomas is the great synthesis, not of Catholicism and Aristotle, but of the Augustinian Catholicism that he knew so well, and Aristotle. Aristotle in the Summa. The second thing, though, the thing that ties it all together, right, is our American Pope that we know is also from Peru, a global citizen. But the one thing that is being represented in the chair of St. Peter right now is American higher education in the Catholic tradition. And Pope Leo is a graduate of a university that was founded because of anti-Catholic riots in the 19th century, an immigrant Catholicism that then suggested that there is something about this great intellectual tradition that is of use to the United States. So I think one of the things that we're going to see from Pope Leo's Augustinianism, in addition to things like having collegiality in the Vatican, having a way of life that is anchored in community, recognizing that our journey to God is never one that is alone. We are on pilgrimage to our true home, which is with God, but the beauty of that pilgrimage is it's not as an individual, it is as a community. And what I think that means for us to imagine is that Pope Leo knows all the way down that there are gifts of a church that recognizes that we are restless in our desire for a love that can actually respond to our infinite love for our Creator. And I think that is the key insight of the Doctrine of Grace. There's a gratuity to love. So to get back to that idea from Benedict XVI, the gratuitousness of what it means to be Catholic in the world, to show forth God's love in that desire that we have. There it is. I'm going to be quiet because Michael Sean brought up Tolle Lege, so we're not going to have a mini lecture on the Confapit style.
Well, we have to wrap up now anyway. We've run out.
Can I just say a quick thing on that, which is
Good.
the
What- a quick
challenge there is how do you preach a gospel of grace and gratitude in a culture of grievance?
Yes.
And this is, again, my dear friends in the theological community, that issue of Augustine, and also kind of I just mentioned it in passing, the trajectory from Leo to Leo. Everybody should have in your back pocket by Christmas a 30 or 60-minute lecture from Leo to Leo.
Leo 13th to Leo 14th. I think just before we wrap up, because it will be something we should come back to, because I know it's dear to the heart of Dan and the work that he's doing, and it is to me too, in the sense, leaving Augustine aside for a minute and Aquinas and all the great shapers of the Catholic sensibility in relation to Prevost, the issue of papal politics. How does an American pope enter into that orbit? We know, just to give us a short history here, that the Germanophilic pope, Pius XII, didn't handle the relationship with the Reich very well. And there were all kinds of reasons, many of them understandable. Paul VI had an interesting relationship with Italian political life. And in fact, of course, was much drawn to one of its prime ministers. Benedict pretty well avoided getting caught in the German maelstrom, largely because many of the German episcopate opposed him. John Paul II helped to bring down the regime. Francis avoided even going to Argentina. So all the popes have different relationships with the countries that produced them. How is Leo going to fit within that orbit? That 20-year Latin American experience seems to me is going to be very formative. What happens in the context of synodality is going to shape him. But it does seem to me that there's very possibly, and it isn't partisan particularly, it's ethical, where a collision between the first American pope and your current American president is on the horizon. But maybe that's for another show, because it's a topic of considerable and ever-shifting magnitude. So we can't deal with that right now. And perhaps we can bring you back, Michael Sean, to be part of that conversation. And Dan, you can get working on that book. It's been a pleasure. This is episode 4. It's been lively and animated as it always is. And we always have to cut it short because the topic and the dynamic go on for hours. We hope you enjoy it. We'll be back on December 17th, I think, with the next episode of Cor Ecclesiae. I'm Michael W. Higgins, and thank you for watching.